All right. All right. I am going to mute myself. I'm going to throw Adam on the spot to Adam, are you there to be thrown on the spot?
Maybe.
As you all know, Adam operates our weekly phenology walks and keeps track of all of our phenology data here on site. And so our current spring intern, Julianna, who is going to be presenting to you today, has been working with Adam and really taken to looking at the phenology here on site and the plants, the flora here on site. And so, Adam, do you want to speak a little bit about the phenology walks that you do here and how you've worked with Julianna on her project?
So yeah, as a few of you know, we have weekly phenology walks. Basically, we walk preset paths throughout the property once a week, and we document anything we see in flower. So we're keeping track of seasonal changes in flowering time and building a long-term data set that we can then analyze later and look at long-term changes. So Julianna's joined me during her time here on our walks, and she's been very good at finding flowers, especially things that I step over quite frequently. So she's done a little bit of her own little data analysis that she's going to talk with you about today. And yes, it is fun. It is quite fun.
Thank you for that introduction, Adam. Everyone can hear me, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, everyone can see that. Okay. Sorry. All right, so welcome to Fun with Phenology. Like Adam said, I joined him on the phenology walks that we do every Wednesday morning. And so I will talk a little bit about what we've seen and all the data that I collected and put into some Excel sheets and all that good stuff. So what exactly is plant phenology? Plant phenology is the study of the timing of biological events in plants. So things like the leaves unfolding, the flowering, the ripening of the fruit, changing in colors, and then like the leaves falling off in fall. And these can be caused by biotic factors, which are any living things, and then abiotic factors, which are non-living things, so like wind, water, climate, stuff like that. And at Litzinger, we focus on the timing of flowering. So we are observing the flowering plants along our transects. And the study was started in 2014 and was based off of a study done at Shaw. Okay, so why are we doing this? We're doing this to keep records of seasonal changes. So when spring starts, summer, fall, winter, stuff like that. And then we're gonna look at year-to-year changes. So are there things that we hadn't seen before that we are seeing now, or are there things that we have seen and aren't seeing? And then how our property is like how our management responses are how they're affecting our land, and then any environmental changes, so like the MSD project, how maybe that is affecting our flowerings, And then what pollinators are being seen. So we've got a little swallowtail caterpillar here, and then we've got a eastern bumblebee here on some Amsonia. So on site, we have 3 different habitats. Our first habitat that we walk through is the bottomland prairies. So the bottomland is referring to being in the floodplain. And the prairie just meaning that there are very few trees to no trees. And all of our prairies are tall grass prairies. And then our bottomland woods. So they'll have a tree canopy, and then there'll also be some understory plants, and bottomland again being in the floodplain. And then we have our edge habitat. So we are studying the edge effect, which is where 2 different habitats meet. So we are looking up until the tree line in the woodlands, and then about a meter into the prairie. And we're looking at the diversity there to see if it's any different from like inside of the habitat. So here's a nice map of our property. We have the glass house here, and then the cabin and barn are down here, and then the MSD path and the creek are over here. So we have 7 different transects. We have our North Prairie, our North Woods and North Edge, our South Prairie, our South Edge, our South Woods, and then our Pasture Prairie. So we will walk among all of these transects, and we will look for flowering plants. And for each transect, we mark down the species that we see. And so that's my little introduction into the phenology. And now we're going to move on to the data that I have collected. So we're going to start with like overall data, then we're going to move on to native and non-native plants for each habitat. Well, here's like the overall calculations. So over the 9 weeks that I've collected data, we had 613 observations. And then out of those observations, we had 81 unique species. And so for our first habitat is our prairies. This is a picture of the South Prairie. So for our overall prairie plant data, so this is including the native and non-native plants. Here's a nice graph of when they were flowering. So these orange bars are when they were first seen to when they were last seen. And then we have all of the scientific names here. And so in total, over all of the prairies, we found 38 unique species. The South Prairie was the most species rich out of all of the prairies with 30 species, and the North Prairie had the most observations with 90 observations. So 46.9% of the species were found in the prairies, and 41.9% of the observations were in the prairies. And for the native prairie plants, I have some pictures. So we have our false indigo bush here. We have our native iris. We have the shining blue star, the wood betony, the golden Alexander, and our wild hyacinths here. Just so that you all can see what some of the flowers that we have been looking at. So again, we have our little chart of when these species were flowering. And so in total, there were 25 native prairie plants that we counted. The north and south prairies both had 18 unique species in them. And then the North Prairie and Pasture Prairie both had 40 observations among the 9 weeks. So 65.8% of the species that we found in the prairie were native. And the native prairie species make up 30.9% of all of the species that we counted among all of the habitats. And for the non-native prairie plants, we've got the Star of Bethlehem here. We've got some vetch down here, and then the yellow rocket here. So again, we have our little chart of all the species and when they were flowering. And then there were a total of 14 non-native prairie plants that we counted. The South Prairie and the Pasture Prairie having the most with 12, and then the North Prairie and Pasture Prairie having the most observations with 49. And 36.8% of the species found in the prairies were non-native. And the non-native prairie species make up 17.3% of all of the species that we counted among the habitats and transects. So that's it for the prairies. We'll move on to the woodlands next. So this is a picture of the Southwoods.
Julianna,
yeah.
before you move on, can you go back to that last slide of the exotic plants in the prairie?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out to the volunteers here on this graph, the pictures that Julianna showed, those 3 species are probably the most prominent ones actually living within the prairies themselves. But a lot of these other exotics that you see on here, if you're familiar with those scientific names, a lot of these are your typical like lawn weeds. So a lot of these are the things that you will commonly see in our lawn areas here and within the trails themselves. So the trails are still considered a part of the prairie. And so we count those lawn species that are within those parts of the transects. So if you were curious, like a lot of these long blooming species that she had seen for, I believe a couple of those were like all 9 weeks that you saw on that very first graph. A few of those were our exotic lawn weeds that bloom early and consistently rebloom because of our mowing regimen.
Yep. So for the woodlands, so the overall woodland data, there were quite a few more than the prairies. So again, you can see both the native and non-native species and when they were flowering. So in total, we had 48 species that we counted in the woodlands. The Southwoods had 43 species compared to the Northwoods having 27, and then the Southwoods had 145 observations. So 59.3% of the species we found were found in the woodlands, and 37.5% of the observations were in the woodlands. So for the non-native woodland plants, I took quite a few photos. Up here we have our wild ginger, we have our spiderwort, the wild geraniums, the spring beauties, the bluebells, the celandine poppies here, the blue-eyed Marys, the bloodroot, Mayapples, Jacob's ladder, and the Virginia waterleaf with a bumblebee on it. I believe that one was a 2-spotted, but I am not sure anymore.
That sure
Um,
looks like it.
So for the natives, again, here are the blooming times. So our spring ephemerals were very showy. They kind of got a late start though. They didn't start till like beginning of April, mid-April. So in total, we had 36 native woodland species. The South Woods had 34 native woodland species, and we had 118 observations in the South Woods. So 77.1% of the species found in the woodlands are native. And the native woodland species make up 45.7% of all of the species that we counted among the different transects. And for the non-native woodland plants, so we've got some garlic mustard here, which some of the Friday guys I know fairly well. And the periwinkle, Japanese honeysuckle, or not Japanese, sorry, the bush honeysuckle, and the Star of Bethlehem. And so, like James was saying, some of these were like kind of lawn weeds because they were mainly in the trails, but some of them were out in the woodlands. So these are their flowering times. We counted 12 non-native woodland plants among the two transects. They both had 10 different species in them, and the Northwoods had the most observations with 30. And so 25% of the species found in the woodlands were non-native. And the non-native woodland species make up 14.8% of all the species counted among the transects. So now we'll move on to the edge. This is our south edge here. So overall, these are all of our edge species, both native and non-native. So we counted 40 species in total on the edge. The south edge had the most with 30 species, and the south edge also had the most observations with 75. So 49.4% of the species were found along the edge, and 20.6% of the observations were along the edge. So for our native edge plants, we have the red buckeye here, our red bud here, we have copper iris, and violets. So for the native edge plants, they also kind of got a late start here. And so there were 27 native edge plants in total, the south edge having 21 species. And then there were 46 observations, which was more than the north edge on the south edge. So 67.5% of the species found along the edge were native. And the native edge species make up 33.3% of the species counted on all the transects. And then for the non-native edge plants, so these are kind of your common lawn weeds. So you got the creeping Charlie or ground ivy. You've got white clover, and then you've got your dandelions, and then there's also a little Veronica kind of in here too. And then there's the Eurasian honeybee on the dandelion. So our non-native edge plants, And when they were flowering, like in most of the other habitats, the ground ivy was blooming almost the entire time. So in total, there were 15 non-native edge plants or species, and the north edge had the most with 12. And then the north edge also had the most observations with 33. 37.5% of the species found along the edge are non-native. And the non-native edge species make up 14.8% of all of the species that were counted on the transects. So taking all of that data, what I found was that the South Woods was our most species-rich transect and had the most native species and the most observations, which makes sense because of the fact that it was spring ephemeral season. So it should have been very, very showy. And our north edge was the least species rich transect, had the least amount of native species and the least amount of observations. So it's in between the prairie and the North Prairie and the North Woods. So edge habitats usually don't have as much biodiversity because of having a lot of disturbance in it. So that's our walking path. So there are more non-natives there. Our woodlands was the most species-rich habitat and had the most native plants. Again, the spring ephemerals really bumping that up. Our prairies had the most observations, but was the least species-rich habitat and had the least amount of native species. Prairies won't get to their peak bloom until further into the summer. So probably like July is when there'll be a lot more flowering happening there. And the edge habitats had the most non-native species. So those are being disturbed. There's going to be a lot of lawn weeds and a lot of non-natives being able to come in and root themselves there. So the north edge, the South Prairie, and the pasture prairie transects had the most non-native species. And then, so going back to why phenology is important, like from the beginning, so keeping record of seasonal changes so we can see the difference of when the spring ephemerals are flowering each year. So lands management responses, so like prescribed fires and invasive removal. So going into the woods and removing the garlic mustard and the bush honeysuckle should hopefully help bring in more native plants. Like there was a burn last year in the North Woods and some trout lilies came up. And then the South Prairie was burned also. So environmental changes, the first like 3 weeks of my internship, it was really cold. So everything kind of got a late start. And then we had some frosts kind of later in the season, but they weren't too bad. And then so some more pollinators. Again, there's the eastern bumblebee here, the swallowtail, and I believe it was a skipper up here on some yellow rocket. So are these pollinators going to certain plants? Are they only going to certain plants like the monarchs where they lay their eggs? What are they doing on these plants? And when are we seeing them? And here's just a bunch of photos for you. Are there any questions? Let me see if I can. Hold on.
Great job, Juliana. You may want to keep your screen sharing just in case anybody has questions based on any like the slides or anything.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Oh, why is this not? don't know how to get my mouse back. Okay.
I see Anne has her hand up. Go ahead, Anne.
Okay, this is probably kind of silly, but I noticed on a lot of the charts, the total of observations was a number that I didn't quite know what it included. So it had, North Prairie, South Prairie, total, but then right at the bottom, it had total. So it usually included a couple of extra something. Can you explain that? I mean,
Yeah, so
yeah, okay.
I will go find
Any,
one.
yeah, like that one right there. Whoops.
Yeah, I'll
Any
do
of
more of a overall.
Yeah.
So the total
Yeah.
here is the total number of species that were found
Okay.
in the habitat. So this total, right? That's what you're
Right.
talking about?
Right.
Okay, yeah, so this is the total number of species. So we have the total number of species per transect here. So 21 total species in the north edge and 30 species in the south edge. So taking both of those transects and pulling out the different species in that transect will get you a total of 40 species in total over those transects. So there's going to be some repeating in some of the transects, and then some of them will have species that are unique to that transect.
Okay, I see. Yeah, so it's a combination of the north edge and the south edge in this particular observation. Okay, all right, thank you. I just was confused about that. Okay,
yeah,
appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
And we just had one pop into the chat. Are you seeing significant trends in the data?
So that's kind of hard to tell with so little data. So because I've only done it over, oh my gosh, I can't put this away now. Okay. So it's kind of hard to tell unless I could go back and look at past data because all of that is on the website from the past few years, but only having like a few years worth of data is going to be kind of hard to tell these trends. But a lot of the non-natives are going to be flowering longer because most of them are in the mow path, at least in the prairie. So they're going to be flowering longer. So they're being cut back and then they're reflowering.
And Adam, do you want to speak to that at all? Because I mean, you've looked over kind of all 8 years of the data. Do you see any just small trends? I know 8 years is really hard to even pull trends out of that, but are you seeing any kind of even like small trends?
Yeah, so with the way our project is set up, it's like we do have a lot of data, but in terms of looking at long-term trends, like as they relate to climate change, for example, it's still very small. So it'll really take a while before we're able to see like what's actually like big, like any big shifts in flowering time. Like we can compare year to year, like, oh, like such and such thing flowered a week earlier or a week longer than it did the year before. And that could be because of like the burn. So smaller term things like that, like we can see. And then also certain species might have been present like in early years that aren't around anymore. It's just like year-to-year changes, like, yeah, we can look at that, but it's harder to look at like big shifts.
And even though too, like this phenology data collection here on site was started 8 years ago, and it was based off of the work happening out at Shaw Nature Reserve that had happened many years ago. Even comparing it against that data would be kind of problematic because the two sites are very different. in their bloom phenology. It seems like quite many species out at Shaw bloom a little bit earlier than us, and then some are a little bit later than us, and we're talking just like a matter of like a week to 2 weeks difference between the species. But that's still enough to like throw the data off when comparing the two different sites. So like Adam said, it'll take many years before we could probably really see some dramatic trends, but luckily we got Adam here tracking this data and continuing to put reports together for it each year. So we'll be able to have this for the future for people to look back on. And those are available on our website. And we do have some research partners with Maryville University and Dr. Kira Krakos's lab. They're not long-term partnerships with these students. They're kind of going in and out of the program pretty quickly, but they're, as a lab as a whole, in Dr. Krakos's lab, that they're looking at different species here on site and comparing them against things out at Shaw Nature Reserve and stuff like that. So no other people are taking advantage and are going to be taking advantage of our phenology data outside of just in-house. It looks like we got some more questions in the chat. Do all of these sites reseed themselves, or does the horticulture group spread new seeds seasonally? Adam, you want to take that one?
Yeah, we have to replant this every year. It's a lot of work. No, so most of the sites do just reseed themselves. We will like say after a burn, we might go and like throw some seed out, try to like make a few things more abundant, but for the most part, we don't do a whole lot of seeding into the prairies. We have done a little bit of planting in the prairies, either to try to introduce new species, or like moving species, like for instance, we had to move a bunch of stuff out of the MSD path. We planted those around that weren't really found anywhere else.
So Adam, can you address that? I'm noticing, at the 23 years that I've been out here, that there is a lot more of the spiderwort in the South Prairie, and I don't remember ever having that much. I mean, I was just standing out there this morning and just looking at it and just really enjoying it. So good job on that. But can you address that?
Yeah, I don't really know what spiderwort. I mean, definitely spiderwort seems to have like a bumper crop this year. I'm not sure what factors have played into that. Like maybe we're just doing a really good job at managing the prairies. It is post burn.
I will say, just from my brief experience in this field too, it's working out at Shaw. I would always see spiderwort flourish more post burn.
Yeah, so I mean, it might just be like, since there might have been more spiderwort in the South Prairie anyway, and now like after a burn, it's just like super happy. And plus with the wet spring we've seen large like growth spurts in all of our flora. So like the next couple of years, like after this, like it might not be as much, but hey, that's something to keep an eye on for sure.
And just going back to Barbara's question real quick too, Adam's been doing, like, out of all these transects specifically, the areas where Adam's done the most work with interns and volunteers would be the south edge transect, the north edge transect, and the south woods. The prairies have been kind of, up until we get into the MSD restoration work, we won't be really, kind of doing any kind of prairie seedings. But Adam has been doing invasive species removal and some woodland edge and woodland seeding along those 3 transects specifically. That would probably be like the only seeding that's happening along transects. So potentially in the future, the phenology data might show that there's more species richness in the future along those transects as we remove invasives. Cindy's got a question about parasitic daughter. So I'm not sure I completely understand, Cindy. Like, is it just had we seen it so far on the phenology transects, or have we just seen it in general? Because it's a more of like a summer bloomer, so it wouldn't show up in that respect. Me personally, I have not seen any just out on the trails. Adam, have you?
I remember seeing some earlier this year. I gotta check my INAT. It might have been at Shaw.
Yeah,
we saw it at Shaw. We do have it though. It is present on site. So the 2 biggest areas that I know we've seen it are in the like southwest corner of the South Prairie. We get a lot of it, like up towards the glass house.
Yes.
Which it was burned this year, so it might not be as prevalent like post burn, or it might be super abundant post burn. I'm not actually sure. And then there's also a good spot for it in the North Prairie, but I think that might have been taken out by MSD. It's typically, I don't think it's really, I think it is on the north edge transect, if it is still there.
Yeah.
But none of the others, and it doesn't, like as James said, it doesn't really flower until summertime, but you can find it. It will be growing now. So if anybody sees like spaghetti dumped on the prairie, that's what that is.
And I almost feel like maybe it just puts on a lot more growth too towards like the beginning of summer, because I feel like we always have it, and it just suddenly appears like it's pretty quick. So I see your comment too, though, that you said you gladly haven't seen it this year. I do want to put out a little, it's not a bad plant. If anything, I feel like it goes after a lot of our weedier species too. So, I mean, it's kind of, parasitic plants are really good in some respects because they help keep certain plants in check and in balance, and, stops them from getting out of control. One of the plants that you're probably very familiar with being on site is the yellow wing stem, which is in a lot of these edge habitats, and it's just really prevalent on site. It's a native plant, it's very weedy. We could definitely stand to have a little less of it, to have more species on site. But I feel like I see dodder attack that, and like some of the goldenrods and things like that, more than other species. So I wouldn't say it's harming anything having it here on site. What about you, Adam? Do you see it particularly on any certain species here?
No, it's like mostly wingstem and goldenrod. It doesn't seem to be doing much good. Like I've seen it in like some of the higher quality prairies, like out west, like just big, like literally someone cooked a giant pot of spaghetti and just dumped it all over this huge section of prairie. But it's just part of the ecology. It's not really good or bad. It's just there. But if you're speaking like in a garden sense, yes, I've heard a lot of gardeners say they do not like it, which is why we it's not something we offer to schools yet. Maybe we can talk to Allison about that. Someone wants to start a spaghetti garden.
All right. Any more questions for Juliana? Her last day is tomorrow. We're all gonna miss her. She's been a blast to have around here. And Colleen, are you still with us?
I am, and I'm gonna miss her too. She's been a big help with the surveys and nest boxes. Juliana, you're gonna be a good birder.
Yeah, I have plans to go to like a beginning bird watching thing next weekend, I think.
Oh, cool, through Audubon or
It's just through a birding thing that I found on Facebook. So
cool.
And a good herper. She's been good at finding little reptiles and things that I almost step on.
Yeah, Juliana's been involved in a lot of the different projects here on site. She's been out every week helping our former summer intern Hannah with all of the box turtle tracking. And so, yeah, she's just been really involved, and we don't always get that with all of our interns, so it's been really nice. Any last questions? You're getting some thank yous and great presentations in the chat. All right. Well, with that, thank you, Juliana. Do you have any final words?
just thank you guys for everything. I appreciate all of the time and having you all here to see my presentation.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And we will have this recording up on our YouTube channel shortly. And our new summer interns will be starting next Monday. So we'll have a new set of interns for you guys to meet and work with over the summer. All right. I'm going to stop recording now.